Dunn. I am a researcher at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm a trained industrial ecologist and have a PhD from UC Davis, looking specifically at the life cycle of lithium-ion batteries. Somehow I've gotten into the policy world though. So I look at EV battery recycling policy and regulations. And we have kind of a shortened session than what I expected. So I'm going to maybe go through these first slides pretty fast, so we have time for discussion. But right now, what I'll be talking about is large format batteries. So the batteries that are in our EVs, that are in our buses. Sometimes when they're in stationary storage as well, I'll be talking about the repurposed batteries. But I will not, be talking about the small format, those that are in our cell phones or our bikes. One thing that I always like to point out is that we're going to have this real, increasing of EV retirements year after year. And this, as we see in this kind of estimation we've done, in the US, we'll see an increase after 2030. And that's really because the EVs retiring today are those kind of first generation sold, those in crashes or under warranty. So we're not really seeing the bulk of retirements at the moment, but those are definitely coming. And lucky for us, when a battery retires, right, from its use in an EV, there are some options for further use. There's options for repurposing these batteries for stationary storage so they can support the grid, they can support a solar system. There's a lot of, they can be backup power, there's a lot of different uses there. There's also sometimes in unique cases the option for refurbishing a battery so it can be put back into an EV. This is something we're mostly seeing in places like Mexico where there's higher demand for these older vehicles. And then there's also the final point of battery recycling. And the recycling process really looks like shredding the batteries, and then doing a chemical process to separate the materials or create a pre-can. And when this is done to the highest standard, you can recover 98% of the cobalt, manganese, lithium, and nickel. Of course, there are various processes, some like smelting that don't recover lithium, and a lot of the recovery does kind of depend on economics of what the value of these minerals are. So jumping to kind of the meat and potatoes of this presentation, I'll just jump to kind of policies that we think are needed to really increase this reuse and recycling markets. And then later I'll kind of go into why. So first is kind of this extended producer responsibility. That's the requirement for producers. So if we're talking about electric vehicles, that's the automakers. The requirement for them to either recycle, reuse, or repurpose the battery at the end of life, in the case that nobody wants the vehicle. So for example, if a dismantler, the folks that actually take the batteries out of the vehicles, if they found a market for this and they can sell it to a recycler, then that's great. The automaker doesn't have to do anything. But if they have this battery and they don't know what to do with it, or say a hazardous waste facility gets it and they're like, we can't really, we don't want to put this in our landfill, then they would call the producer and the producer would be responsible. Next is we want to ensure that recycling actually recovers the minerals and has a low impact process. This may seem silly, right? It's like, what is recycling without recovery? But, historically, recycling hasn't always been a good actor. And we see that there are different recycling processes out there. Like I said, smelting doesn't recover lithium. We want to ensure that lithium is recovered so that we can actually reduce future mining. And then the third kind of main bullet is increased access to information about the batteries to encourage refurbishing and repurposing. Information mainly being, that is state of health information. So what is what is the potential lifespan, future lifespan of the battery, despite it being retired from an EV. And also just information like a label about the capacity, the chemistry, and the hazards of the battery. So this is, this is kind of the overview, the highlight of the presentation, but I'm going to go into kind of why we want recycling and how these policies can work. So there's a lot of benefits to recycling. We can reduce the future newly mined materials. Recycling comes with lessened emissions, air pollution, and water use. So there's a huge environmental benefits that come from this. And when we're talking about recycling, we're talking about recovering mainly for minerals. We're talking about nickel, lithium, cobalt, and manganese. Those are kind of the critical minerals that are on everyone's top of mind. Of course, the recycling also recovers, aluminum as well, and some of them can recover graphite, but that's not really happening within the market at the moment. And I won't make you just take my word for recycled materials producing less emissions than newly mined. As an industrial ecologist, I look at the life cycle impacts. So really kind of doing the environmental accounting of what are the emissions of these different processes. And what we find is that, of course, recycling does have emissions, greenhouse gas, NOx, SOx. It's an industrial process, but it has much less than if we mined the minerals originally. So the avoided emission there is kind of the inverse of what mining the materials would be. And the net emissions is a negative because we see that we're avoiding a lot more emissions than we're making. And this is just emissions. This is not, water use, land disturbing, and all these other things that do come with mining. And this is a hydromet process and not which is kind of a chemical-based process and not smelting. So again, I don't want you to take my word for it. So there's a lot of papers that we've written to demonstrate also that there's a potential to offset minerals mined. So up to 60% of lithium used in EVs in the US could come from recycled sources in 2050. That's that green line right there. And that's if we have that 90% lithium recovery. But that, of course, isn't guaranteed, even if the batteries do go to recycling. We could have 80% lithium recovery, 50% lithium recovery, or what we think might be happening right now, where we're unsure if recyclers are even recovering lithium. They might just be recovering higher value minerals like nickel and cobalt. So just another reason we really want to pay attention to what's happening in the market and use policy to really sway that. And then my last reason for recycling is really the study that was published in Nature that shows the avoided mines that we would have to create to recover lithium. The green dots here are the mines that they say would not have to open, that are kind of lower value and would actually increase the price of lithium. So that, if we used an increased lithium recovery and recycling of these batteries. So that kind of leads me to, these are all the reasons that we need to recycle. And the policy that we've, been working on and that has been discussed in this environment is extended producer responsibility. Like I said, where producers are responsible for ensuring unwanted batteries are collected and transported to be reused, repurposed, and recycled. And I think the key word there is the unwanted, because we're not saying the producer, has to take back every single battery that reaches the end of its life. It's the batteries that are not taken care of by the market, but still preserving the market, that end of life dismantling and recycling market that is already in existence. And I feel like there's sometimes a lack of transparency about if recycling is economical. Sometimes we see that it is profitable But we also see that there are kind of four main conditions that may lead to a battery not being profitable to recycle. One is the condition of the battery. If this is a damaged um, battery, then they have to follow additional precautions in the shipping of it, and that can be extremely expensive. Also, just the distance that the vehicle or that the battery has to be transported at its end of life to a recycling facility. We see that it can range from $100 to $400 per battery for transporting based on just distance alone, even if it is in a good condition. And with that, of course, it always matters, how many batteries are actually transported on the truck, considering that these do have to be, hazardous waste class 9 trucks, and so that's an increased cost. And then lastly, not all batteries are profitable to recycle just because the minerals aren't worth much. We see that mineral prices kind of are fluctuating, and this really does impact the value of the recycling process and that revenue. Due to time, I'm not going to go too far into this, but there's also the aspect of different chemistries, having different amounts of minerals and therefore having different revenue from the recycling. So you'll see that like NMC 111 is a chemistry that was used in the past. It's very economical to recycle in the sense that cobalt and nickel are worth a lot in the recovery, and recyclers are really, they want these kind of batteries. NMC is a newer chemistry that's used. Again, it's a higher value battery for recyclers to recycle. But then we look at LFP, which uses lithium iron phosphate, and we see that those batteries, there is no profitable route to actually get these to be recycled. And that's also a battery that is increasing in use by Tesla, Ford, Rivian, and other folks, because it is a less expensive battery to use, but that also means it's a less profitable battery to recycle. So going into more details of this, I talk to dismantlers and try to see kind of like what's happening in the market. And I have these, and so I've been sent these quotes of that the recycler or that the recyclers have sent the dismantlers. And just to clarify, I feel like dismantlers is a term that I use all the time, but the dismantlers are the folks that take the automobiles and take the parts out of them and sell them, and then also take the scrap and sell them. So they'll be handling a lot of these EV batteries, although not all dismantlers are equipped to that right now. But what we're seeing is that these are quotes that folks got for LFP batteries, and you can see that it's over $1,000 per battery that they were quoted, so they would have to pay that amount, and that doesn't even include the shipping of them. So that's concerning, and this is one of those moments where we do have a very large dismantling market, really small businesses, and there's concern that this could lead to kind of dumping or improper storage or those kind of things if people don't want to pay this. I have some maybe more optimistic quotes as well. This is you can see here there are probably some NCAs here and some NMC batteries and not just LFPs. And the bids that were quoted to them are better. They're around 900, 600. Of course, this doesn't include the cost of shipping. So we would have to knock those down by a couple hundred. But this is the instance where, the EPR probably wouldn't come into effect because hopefully the market would be able to take care of this. So this is just kind of an example of what it looks like on the ground and why this policy is needed, but it might not, be needed for every single battery. Also interesting about this here is that there was no offer given to buyer for all of these batteries below. So those are batteries that the recycler didn't even want to quote and wouldn't take. So that's another instance where there's some issue as to, what is going to happen with those batteries. Somebody needs to take them. Additional benefits of an EPR is the centralized responsibility for recycling. If you're going to say, no landfilling of batteries, they have to be recycled. We have to point to somebody who's responsible for that recycling. And the automakers and the EV market are kind of a small group of large businesses that you can really put that responsibility on, and you can have easier enforcement and regulation. If you put that on just the individual owner of the EV, it's a little bit more difficult. It also, if you put this on the dismantlers, are also a huge decentralized market, and a lot of dismantling actually goes unregulated, which is also a concern. So we see this as kind of the easiest step forward. It also encourages design for disassembly. We see that disassembling of these batteries is expensive, and we want to encourage in the engineering of the batteries and the EVs to design it so that it can be recycled. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is battery labeling. This may seem kind of basic, but putting a battery label or a label on the battery is extremely important to really increase the efficiency of this end of life process. It's not a requirement right now, and it isn't standardized, but those handling the battery at their end of life without this lack vital information about, the battery size, the chemistry, the manufacturer, and all these things that really can help folks figure out what is the value of this battery, and also help figure out kind of for the recycler, how do I sort this, right? Because the recycler does sort based on chemistry to increase the efficiency of their process. California, as part of their advanced clean cars rule, actually had this label as a requirement in FY26. And this is the information that they requested on it. Unfortunately, under the Trump administration, they ruled back the California's ability to regulate their greenhouse gas emissions, and so this kind of got scrapped along with their ACC requirements. So it's not law anymore. Okay, then the last kind of policy grouping is access to information for safe reuse and repurposing. Now, just to kind of get everyone on the same level, repurposing batteries is happening at the moment. It's done in different ways. This is BTU, just an example of a company that really, the way they repurpose, you can see in here, is they take out the whole battery pack and connect them together. This isn't always how it's done. Sometimes they break it down to modules, sometimes they break it down to cell level. And there are, a lot of benefits of repurposing. One is just extending the lifespan and use of the batteries, so making sure that we don't have to kind of break it down and start all over. Again, we're going to have, need a lot of stationary storage on the grid as we transition to renewables. And this really does replace the need for additionally manufacturing batteries. And again, I love my life cycle assessments. This was a study I did with UC Davis, where we looked at kind of what, is there an environmental benefit to repurposing batteries over, taking old batteries, recycling them, and creating new ones that are maybe, more efficient and newer technology. So really, you'll see on the left, those two bars are those batteries that were recycled and then manufactured new advanced technology batteries for stationary use. And the bar on the right was the repurposed battery that had a lower lifespan, and was less efficient. And what we really found is that despite the lessened lifespan and despite kind of the decreasing efficiency over time as the battery had wear, there was actually an environmental benefit to repurposing, a pretty large one. So with that said, there's barriers to repurposing. There's the inability to really determine the state of health for folks that are on the ground and really hands-on with these batteries. Again, those dismantlers. There's difficulty with battery disassembly. All batteries are not created equal. I've heard, sometimes specifically with Tesla batteries, they're very difficult to take apart because of the cells and the way they glue them together, while others have brackets and more module-based systems. And so determining the state of health is, not only determining if the battery should go to a repurposer versus a recycler, but also if the repurposer should purchase this battery, because they're kind of taking a risk if they don't have that access to information. And then, of course, with decreasing battery prices, which is great, it just means that the repurposers are having to compete with a lower price point, and that's been difficult when there are these barriers to disassembly and accessing state of health. State of health, not only helps this repurposing market, but it also helps the folks that are trying, the dismantlers that are actually trying to determine if they are going to send this to a repurposer or a recycler and how much money they can get for it. Repurposers are willing to pay more than recyclers because there's a higher value to it. And so this can really, help those folks within the end stream determine where batteries go, but also be able to charge a higher price point for the product that they have. So it looks like I have 9 minutes left, and I'm gonna try to not spend that whole time so we have time for questions. But I'll go into the European Union battery regulation. This passed a couple years ago. They're still in the implementation phase. It is what I would say kind of the gold standard right now of what EV recycling policy could look like. It has an extended producer responsibility. It has required recovery rates for lithium, cobalt, and nickel. And it does so, bracketing up. So it recognizes that lithium right now isn't very economical to recover and says you only have to recover 50% now, but that's going to increase to 80%. It also, sets cobalt and nickel recovery requirements higher at, I believe, 90%. It requires the use of recycled materials in new batteries. So it's really creating this required closed loop, right? So the batteries have to go to the recyclers, the minerals have to be recovered, and then new batteries have to be made with recycled materials. They also have require access to battery management system to verify state of health of battery. So really requiring the access to this information so that repurposing is incentivized. In the US, we haven't seen anything at the federal level, but states have proposed a lot of legislation. This is actually a graph I made. So it's a little out of date. All of these that are green that says legislation proposed have actually failed. So there's blue where New Jersey has passed a regulation. In my opinion, the New Jersey regulation really only, it doesn't have much enforcement. It really just requires the OEMs to create a plan. So I would say it's not really going far enough. But I've been working a lot on the California regulation, legislation, which has been in process for the last 3 years. There were some studies that happened for the 3 years before that, and it's going to be taken up next year. And I can go into more detail of what that looks like. It has an extended producer responsibility, the one that I've kind of been preaching this whole time about, automakers responsible. Oh, and this is also out of date, sorry. The automaker is responsible no matter what. It also qualifies recyclers. So instead of putting recycling recovery rate within the legislation. It says that the regulator has to create requirements for the recycler, including looking at the environmental impact and also their recovery rates. It also does not allow for smelting in that qualified recycler. And that is because of the additional emissions and also because of the lack of recovery of lithium. It requires tracking of batteries, so we know actually what happens to these batteries at their end of life. It requires reporting of mineral recovery rates and encourages state of health information. Yeah, so I mentioned that, and I'd love in this last 5 minutes to take any questions.